Greedy children wanted to put their mother in a nursing home on Christmas. When the porcelain angel broke, their father's secret left everyone shocked. What secrets can a cherished Christmas angel hold? In Cedar Mills, Vermont, a widowed mother's unwavering faith in family traditions is about to collide with her son's modern ambitions. As the final Christmas deadline approaches, a porcelain angel that has watched over 40 years of Sullivan family celebrations guards one last gift from a father to his children, a gift that will test their values and reveal the true meaning of wealth. Join us for a touching story about faith, family, and the unexpected miracles that happen when we remember what matters most during the Christmas season. Let's begin our story. The December wind whistled through the old Victorian house in Cedar Mills, Vermont, as Margaret Sullivan carefully climbed the stepladder to hang the last of her handmade Christmas wreaths. At 68, she wasn't as steady as she used to be, but some traditions were worth the extra effort. The wreath, made from pine cones she'd collected with her late husband James, had crowned their front door every Christmas for 40 years. "Just a little higher," she muttered, stretching up on her tiptoes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the hook, the familiar scent of pine needles, bringing back memories of James standing in this very spot, his strong hands keeping the ladder steady as he teased her about her perfectionism. "The wreath needs to be exactly centered, doesn't it, Maggie?" he would say with that gentle smile of his. "Just like everything else in your Christmas wonderland." The sudden blast of a car horn startled her, making the ladder wobble. Margaret grabbed the doorframe to steady herself, her heart pounding. Outside, a sleek black SUV had pulled into her snow-covered driveway, and a man in an expensive suit was stuffing something into her mailbox. Once her pulse settled, Margaret carefully descended the ladder and made her way to the mailbox. 2 envelopes waited inside. The first bore the logo of Heritage Development Corporation. Another offer to buy her property, no doubt. The second made her heart sink. A notice about the upcoming auction of the local church where she and James had married 42 years ago. Back inside, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of peppermint tea as she opened the developer's letter. The numbers made her eyes widen. $5 million, more than she'd ever imagined her modest home could be worth. But it wasn't just the house they wanted. It was the entire block, prime real estate for their new shopping mall. "Final offer before year end," she read aloud, her voice echoing in the empty kitchen. "Please consider your future security." The shrill ring of the telephone cut through her thoughts. The caller ID showed her oldest son's number. "Mom?" Thomas's voice carried that familiar note of impatience. "Did you receive the letter?" "Hello to you too, Thomas. Yes, I just got it." $5 million, Mom. $5 million! You could live like a queen in one of those luxury retirement communities we showed you. Margaret's gaze drifted to the collection of Christmas ornaments waiting to be hung, each one holding a precious memory. The angel tree topper caught her eye, James's mother's angel, the one he always insisted should watch over their family. "This is our home, Thomas. Your father and I raised you children here, every Christmas." "Mom, please don't start with the Christmas memories again. You can't live on memories. Be practical for once." Margaret closed her eyes, remembering James's last Christmas with them. "Keep the angel close, Maggie," he'd whispered from his hospital bed. "She's watching over more than just our Christmas celebrations." "Mom, are you listening? We need to make a decision before the new year. The developers won't wait forever." "I'm listening, Thomas. I'm always listening." She walked to the box of decorations and gently lifted the porcelain angel. "But some things are worth more than money." "The house is falling apart, Mom. You can barely manage the maintenance. What happens when?" "I need to go, Thomas. I have Christmas decorations to hang." She hung up before he could protest, holding the angel close to her heart. In the fading afternoon light, its porcelain face seemed to hold a secret smile, just like James used to have, when he knew something others didn't. Margaret carried the angel to her favorite armchair by the window and sat down heavily. "What were you trying to tell me that last Christmas, James?" she whispered, tracing the angel's delicate wings. "What am I supposed to protect?" Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the town in a fresh blanket of white. Margaret watched as children rushed home from school, their excitement for the upcoming holidays evident in their bouncing steps. This was what she couldn't explain to Thomas, how this house wasn't just walls and a roof, but a keeper of 40 years of Christmas memories, of family traditions, of love that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. The angel in her hands seemed to grow warmer, almost as if responding to her touch. Tomorrow, she would start decorating the tree, just as she had every year since James's passing. But tonight, she would pray for guidance, for strength, and for her children to remember what their father had always taught them, that the greatest gifts couldn't be bought or sold. Thomas Sullivan stared at his office computer screen in downtown Manhattan, his jaw clenched as he read the latest email from his investors. The meeting he'd been dreading was set for tomorrow morning. 5 years of aggressive investments were coming back to haunt him, and now his clients wanted answers about their missing funds. His office phone buzzed. "Mr. Crawford is here to see you," his assistant announced. "Tell him I'm in a meeting. He says he won't leave until you speak with him." Thomas loosened his tie and glanced at the family photo on his desk. Last Christmas, when he'd tried one final time to convince his mother to sell the house. If only she knew how desperately he needed that money now. Across town in Chicago, his brother William faced his own crisis. His wife Sarah was showing him brochures for a winter vacation in Switzerland. "The kids would love skiing in the Alps," she said, not noticing his pained expression. William thought about the stack of unpaid credit card bills hidden in his desk drawer. The truth about their financial situation would devastate Sarah, who'd grown accustomed to their lavish lifestyle. His investment firm was hemorrhaging money, and their savings were nearly depleted. "Maybe we should visit Mom for Christmas instead," he suggested carefully. Sarah's face fell. "That old house? William, you promised we'd go to Europe this year." The youngest Sullivan brother, Michael, sat in his cramped university office, grading papers from his American literature students. A knock on his door interrupted his work. "Come in," he called out. The department head entered, looking troubled. "Michael, we need to talk about the budget cuts." Michael's heart sank. He'd feared this conversation was coming. The small liberal arts college where he taught was struggling financially, and rumors of closures had been circulating. "How bad is it?" he asked. "We're not sure we can keep the department open past spring semester." Michael thought of his mother's house, of all the Christmas mornings he'd spent there reading books by the fireplace while his brothers played with their new toys. Now Thomas and William wanted to sell it, as if those memories meant nothing. His phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Conference call tonight about Mom. No excuses." That evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen, sorting through old Christmas photos. One caught her eye, James standing in front of an empty lot next to their house, smiling that mysterious smile of hers. She turned the photo over and noticed writing she'd never seen before. "Investment in our future. J.S." The doorbell rang, startling her. It was Mrs. Peterson, her elderly neighbor of 40 years. "Margaret, I brought you some gingerbread," she said, entering the warm kitchen. "I heard about the developers. You know, your James used to help so many families around Christmas time. Remember that year when the Johnsons lost everything in the fire? James somehow found them a place to stay." Margaret nodded, thinking about how many secrets her husband had kept, always helping others quietly. Later that night, she listened as her 3 sons argued over speakerphone. "Mom's being unreasonable," Thomas insisted. "That house is worth a fortune now." "The developers won't wait forever," William added. "We need to convince her before someone else buys up the surrounding properties." Michael's voice cut through. "That's our childhood home you're talking about. Dad would never." "Dad's not here anymore," Thomas snapped. "And Mom can't manage alone much longer." Margaret turned off the lights and walked upstairs, the angel topper cradled in her arms. In the quiet darkness, she could almost hear James's voice. "The angel watches over more than just Christmas, Maggie. She knows when the time is right." Mrs. Peterson's words about James's secret generosity echoed in her mind. What else had her husband planned for their future? Whatever it was, she knew she had to protect it, just as she had to protect the true meaning of Christmas that James had always cherished: family, generosity, and love above all else. Thomas drummed his fingers on the table at the upscale Manhattan restaurant where he'd arranged to meet William. His brother was late, as usual. The waiter approached for the third time, but Thomas waved him away. He couldn't eat, not with the weight of what he had to confess. William finally rushed in, shaking snow from his coat. "Sorry, Sarah's Christmas shopping drained our main account. Had to move some money around." "That's exactly what we need to talk about." Thomas lowered his voice. "The investors are asking questions. They want to know why their quarterly statements don't match the bank records." William's face paled. "How much time do we have?" "Until January 5th. They're threatening to go to the SEC. That's impossible. We need at least 6 months to." "We don't have 6 months," Thomas cut him off. "We need Mom's house sold before New Year's. She won't sell. You know how she is about Christmas there." Thomas pulled out his phone and showed William an email. "I've been talking to a lawyer. There might be a way, but we need to act fast." As their conversation continued in hushed tones, neither brother noticed the elderly couple at the next table, friends of their mother from church, listening with growing concern. Meanwhile, Michael was in his mother's study, helping her organize old Christmas decorations, when he found a folder of property documents. "Mom, did Dad leave any instructions about the house?" Margaret was about to answer when the phone rang. She picked up the extension in the kitchen, but before announcing herself, she heard Thomas's voice. "The lawyer says we need proof she's not thinking clearly," Thomas was saying. "Her refusal to sell could be evidence of diminished capacity." "You want to declare our mother incompetent?" William's voice shook. "You have a better idea? The developers need an answer by December 26th. If we don't get that money..." Margaret quietly replaced the receiver, her hands trembling. In the study, she heard Michael shuffling papers, getting closer to the truth about James's property purchases. The next morning, Thomas was removing old decorations from the living room when he found the advent calendar their mother had sewn years ago. Christmas scenes decorated each pocket, holding small treats and Bible verses. "We don't need this taking up space during the showing," he muttered, dropping it into a garbage bag. Margaret watched from the doorway as her son discarded decades of Christmas memories. Once he left, she retrieved the calendar from the trash, holding it close as tears filled her eyes. "I don't understand," Michael said that evening, confronting his brothers on a video call. "Why the sudden rush to sell?" "The market won't stay this high forever," Thomas argued. "And what about Mom's wishes? What about everything Dad built here?" "Dad's gone, Michael. We need to think practically." "Practical? Like those investment schemes you two?" "Enough," William interrupted. "We're doing this for Mom's own good." After the call, Margaret sat in her rocking chair, the rescued advent calendar in her lap. She opened the first pocket and found a faded note in James's handwriting. "The greatest gifts are the ones that can't be bought." She looked up at the angel on the mantle, remembering James's words about watching and waiting. Her sons thought they were keeping secrets, but a mother always knows when her children are in trouble. The question was, how long should she wait before revealing what James had left behind? In their pursuit of quick money, Thomas and William had forgotten the most important lesson their father taught them: that Christmas wasn't about material wealth, but about the richness of family bonds and the joy of giving. As snow fell outside her window, Margaret knew the time for James's final Christmas lesson was approaching. But first, her sons needed to remember what they'd lost. Not just their father, but their understanding of what truly mattered in life. She carefully folded the advent calendar and carried it upstairs to hide it with the other Christmas treasures she'd rescued from her son's misguided attempts to modernize the house. Sometimes, she thought, you had to protect the past to save the future. Margaret knelt in the small chapel of Cedar Mills First Methodist Church, joining her weekly prayer group. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting familiar patterns on the worn carpet where she'd prayed with James for so many years. "Let us pray for those in need this Christmas season," Pastor Roberts said softly. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering a Christmas 20 years ago. James had gathered their children in the living room, not for presents, but for a lesson in giving. "The Johnson family lost their home in a fire," he'd explained, holding a collection jar. How can we help them have Christmas? Young Michael immediately offered his savings. Thomas and William hesitated until James added, "Sometimes the best gifts are the ones that cost us something." The memory faded as Mrs. Peterson touched her arm. "Margaret? Service is over, dear." She opened her eyes to find the chapel nearly empty. "I was just remembering how James taught the boys about giving. He helped so many families," Mrs. Peterson nodded. "Always quietly, never wanting recognition." At home, Michael sorted through his father's old desk, looking for Christmas decorations. Instead, he found a box of receipts and letters. "Mom," he called out, "did you know Dad made monthly donations to the children's hospital?" Before Margaret could answer, a car door slammed outside. Thomas and William were walking up the driveway with a man carrying a clipboard. "Mom," Thomas called out as they entered. "This is Mr. Parker from Heritage Development. He needs to do an assessment." Margaret watched as the man moved through her home, measuring and taking notes. He paused at the collection of Christmas decorations waiting to be hung. "These should all be cleared out for showing," he said. "Buyers want to envision their own space." "These decorations hold 40 years of memories," Margaret protested. "Memories don't increase property value, Mrs. Sullivan," Mr. Parker replied. During dinner, the tension was palpable. Thomas and William criticized everything from the old wallpaper to the handmade Christmas stockings hanging by the fireplace. "This place is stuck in the past," William complained, pushing away his plate. "No buyer will want." "Your father loved this house exactly as it is," Margaret interrupted, her voice firm. "Dad's not here anymore," Thomas snapped. "And this sentimentality isn't helping anyone." Later that night, Margaret climbed the stairs to the attic, cradling the angel topper. The familiar scent of cedar and memories wrapped around her as she sat in James's old chair. "I wish you were here," she whispered to the angel. "The boys have forgotten everything you taught them about Christmas." Her fingers traced the angel's base, feeling the slight gap where James had said something important was hidden. She was about to investigate further when footsteps creaked on the stairs. "Mom?" Michael's voice called out. "There's something you should see." But before she could respond, the mail slot downstairs clattered. Michael retrieved an official-looking envelope and brought it to her. "Final notice," the letter read. "Property sale must be completed by December 26th for current offer to stand." Margaret's hands trembled. One more week, one more Christmas to teach her sons what their father had tried so hard to instill in them. "Michael," she said quietly, "your father used to say that Christmas miracles don't just happen. They're built on faith, love, and patience." "What do you mean, Mom?" Before she could answer, Thomas and William's voices carried up from below. "The social worker will be here tomorrow," Thomas was saying. "Everything needs to look perfect." Margaret held the angel closer, knowing that soon she'd have to choose between keeping James's secret and protecting their children's future. But not yet. First, they needed to remember what Christmas in this house had truly meant. "Come," she told Michael. "Help me bring down the Christmas boxes. Your father always said that sometimes you have to look backward to move forward." As they descended the attic stairs, Margaret said a silent prayer. James had trusted her with more than just memories. He'd trusted her to know when the time was right to reveal his final gift to their family. The social worker, Miss Reynolds, sat in Margaret's living room, taking notes as Thomas and William presented their case. "Mom refuses to consider assisted living despite the obvious risks," Thomas explained. "She almost fell from a ladder last week hanging decorations." "I see," Miss Reynolds said, turning to Margaret. "Mrs. Sullivan, your sons are concerned about your safety." Margaret sat straight in her chair, hands folded calmly in her lap. "I've lived in this house for 40 years. I know every creaky floorboard." "They also mentioned some concerning financial decisions," Ms. Reynolds continued. "Refusing to sell the property. My husband built our life here," Margaret interrupted. "Some things aren't for sale." After the social worker left, Thomas insisted on showing Margaret the Evergreen Senior Living Center. The facility gleamed with modern amenities, but Margaret noticed there were no Christmas decorations in the residents' rooms. "Are holiday decorations not allowed?" she asked the tour guide. "Oh, they're allowed. Just nothing on the walls, and everything must be approved for safety." William pointed out the luxury features: spa services, gourmet meals, daily activities. But Margaret only saw what was missing: the warmth of a real home, the freedom to bake Christmas cookies at midnight, the space to host family gatherings. Meanwhile, Michael was at the county records office, digging through property documents. Something about his brother's sudden urgency felt wrong. He found a file of recent bank transactions that made his stomach turn. Back at the house, Thomas and William were going through closets while Margaret rested upstairs. "Look at this," William said, pulling out a box of old bank statements. Dad was making regular payments for something. Before they could investigate further, Margaret appeared in the doorway. She'd been watching them all afternoon, noting how they dismissed every Christmas decoration, every family photo, every memory as worthless clutter. "Your father kept careful records," she said, making both sons jump. "He believed in planning for the future." "Mom, you should be resting," Thomas said, quickly putting the box away. That evening, Margaret felt the weight of the day settle into her bones. The stress of hiding James's secret, of watching her sons dismiss their heritage, had taken its toll. As she reached for her evening tea, a wave of dizziness struck her. Michael found her sitting on the kitchen floor looking pale. "Mom," he rushed to her side. "What happened?" "Just a spell of weakness," she assured him, but her hands were shaking. The doctor advised rest and reduced stress. Thomas and William saw their opportunity. "See?" Thomas argued with the social worker on the phone. "She can't manage alone anymore. We need to expedite this." But Margaret, lying in bed that night, wasn't as frail as they assumed. She listened to her sons arguing downstairs, their voices carrying through the heating vents. "The investors are threatening legal action," William hissed. "We need that money." "What investors?" Michael demanded. "What aren't you telling me?" Margaret closed her eyes, thinking of the secret hidden in the angel. James had known this day might come. "Watch over them," he'd said. "They'll need guidance when the time comes." In her room, Margaret reached for her Bible, finding comfort in its worn pages. Inside was a pressed flower from her first Christmas with James, when they were young and poor, but rich in dreams. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Michael entered, concern etched on his face. "Mom, I found something at the records office. Thomas and William, they're in trouble, aren't they?" Margaret patted the bed beside her. "Sit with me, Michael. There's something you need to understand about your father's last Christmas with us." But before she could continue, raised voices erupted from downstairs. The emergency interdiction papers had arrived. Tomorrow, everything would change. Margaret touched the angel on her bedside table, feeling the hidden gap in its base. Not yet, she thought. The boys needed to remember what Christmas meant in this house before they could understand their father's final gift. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Cedar Mills in a blanket of white. Margaret watched it drift past her window, remembering how James used to say that snow made everything look new again, ready for a fresh start. The emergency room lights buzzed overhead as Margaret lay on the examination table. Her spell of weakness had turned into chest pains, prompting Michael to rush her to Cedar Mills Hospital, despite her protests. "Mom, why didn't you tell me the stress was getting to you?" Michael asked, holding her hand. "Christmas preparations always make me a little tired," she deflected, but they both knew it was more than that. Dr. Adams reviewed her vitals with concern. "Your blood pressure is too high, Margaret. I'm keeping you overnight for observation." While Margaret rested in the hospital room, Michael drove to the local bank where his father had worked as a senior loan officer for 30 years. Most of the staff had changed, but Mrs. Henderson, the head teller, remembered James Sullivan well. "Such a good man," she said, looking through old records. "Always thinking about others. Did you know he helped many families refinance their homes during the recession?" "Dad never talked much about his work," Michael admitted. Mrs. Henderson lowered her voice. "The month before he passed, he came in several times to meet with Mr. Parker, not the developer, but his father. They spent hours in the conference room with maps of Cedar Mills spread out." Before Michael could ask more questions, his phone buzzed. Thomas was calling. "Where are you?" his brother demanded. "The lawyer needs these interdiction papers filed today." "Mom's in the hospital," Michael snapped. "But I guess that makes your case stronger, doesn't it?" Silence followed. Then William's voice came on the line. "The hospital. Is she okay? Since when do you care? I found your investment records, by the way. Want to tell me what's really going on?" Back in the hospital, Margaret woke to find Thomas sitting by her bed, looking more worried than she'd seen him in years. "Mom, I'm sorry," he began. "We never meant for this to affect your health." "Then stop pushing," she said quietly. "Your father had a plan for this house." "Dad's plans died with him," Thomas replied, but his voice wavered. A nurse interrupted them, bringing a letter that had been delivered to the front desk. Margaret recognized the handwriting immediately. George Patterson, James's oldest friend. "Dear Margaret," the letter read, "I promised James I wouldn't say anything until the time was right, but seeing what's happening with the boys, you should know he spent that last month securing everything. The proof is where he always said our greatest treasures should be. Above us, watching." Margaret folded the letter as Thomas reached for it. Some messages weren't meant for desperate eyes. That evening, the emergency interdiction hearing ended before it began. The judge refused to proceed without Margaret present, giving her time to recover. In her hospital room, Margaret listened as Michael shared what he'd learned at the bank. Thomas and William invested their client's money in some kind of development scheme, he explained. It failed, and now they're facing legal trouble. That's why they need the house sold so quickly. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering James's words that last Christmas. "The boys will face a test someday, Maggie. Money has a way of revealing what's in our hearts." When Michael left to get coffee, Margaret pulled out her phone and called Mrs. Peterson. "Could you check on the angel?" she asked. "Make sure it's safe?" "Of course, dear. Though Thomas and William have been searching the house, they found some of James's old papers in the study." Margaret sat up too quickly, making her head spin. The papers in the study were only part of the story. The real proof of James's foresight was still safely hidden, waiting for the right moment. Later that night, as snow fell outside her hospital window, Margaret thought about the Christmases past in their old house. James had always said that Christmas was about more than giving presents. It was about giving chances. Their sons would soon learn that their father's last gift was more than just property. It was a chance to remember who they really were. The doctor discharged her the next morning with strict orders to avoid stress. But with Christmas just days away and her son's desperation growing, Margaret knew the real test was just beginning. "Your father believed in you boys," she whispered to the falling snow. "He knew you'd find your way back to what matters, even if the path leads through darkness first." Christmas Eve morning arrived with fresh snow and rising tension in the Sullivan house. Margaret stood in her kitchen, preparing the traditional family dinner, despite Thomas and William's protests that she should be resting. "Mom, the caterers could handle everything," William said, checking his phone for the 10th time that hour. Another message from his creditors. "We've never had caterers for Christmas Eve," Margaret replied, rolling out cookie dough. "Your father always said." "Please, not another story about Dad," Thomas interrupted, entering the kitchen. "The developers called. They need our answer by tomorrow morning." The front door opened, bringing a rush of cold air and Michael's children, Emma and Jack, who ran straight to their grandmother. "Grandma, can we help with the cookies?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "First, help me get the decorations from the living room," Margaret smiled. "The tree needs its angel." William's wife Sarah arrived next with their teenagers, both glued to their phones. "The house looks so quaint," she said, eyeing the handmade decorations. "Look what I found," Jack called from the living room. He held up an old folder that had fallen behind the bookcase. Thomas quickly grabbed it, but not before Michael caught a glimpse of bank letterhead. "What's that?" Michael asked. "Nothing important," Thomas said, stuffing the folder into his briefcase. Margaret watched the exchange from the kitchen doorway. She'd seen the folder's date, the month before James passed away. As afternoon turned to evening, more family members arrived. The house filled with voices, some cheerful, some strained. William's children complained about the lack of Wi-Fi, while Emma and Jack discovered the joy of stringing popcorn garlands. "Grandma, tell us about this ornament," Emma said, holding up a faded paper star. "Your father made that in 3rd grade," Margaret explained. It was the year we couldn't afford store-bought decorations. That was a tough Christmas, Michael remembered. But Dad made it special anyway. Thomas checked his watch. Mom, it's getting late. Maybe we should skip the tree decorating this year. No, Emma protested. Daddy said it's tradition. Margaret stood firm. We'll decorate the tree. James never let anything stop our Christmas traditions. As the family gathered around the tree, Margaret brought out the boxes of ornaments. Each one carried a story, a memory that her older grandchildren were too busy to hear, but Emma and Jack listened intently. Michael found another folder tucked between the decorations. This time, he was quick enough to read its contents. Property surveys of the surrounding neighborhood, all dated the month before his father died. Mom, he started, but Margaret shook her head slightly. Not yet. The angel goes on last, she announced, reaching for the porcelain figure. Your father always said. A loud phone call interrupted her. William stepped away to answer it, his face paling. Yes, sir, I understand. First thing tomorrow. Yes, I know it's Christmas. Thomas followed him into the hallway. Their harsh whispers carried back to the living room. We have to get this done tonight. Mom has to sign. No choice. Margaret held the angel, feeling its familiar weight. Through the window, she saw Mrs. Peterson walking past, giving her a knowing nod. The longtime neighbors had kept James's secret all these years, watching and waiting. Grandma, Emma called, why does the angel look different from regular angels? Because she's a guardian angel, Margaret answered, loud enough for her sons to hear. She watches over our family and protects what's most precious. Like Christmas presents? Jack asked. Like truth, Margaret said softly, and love, and the things your grandfather valued most. As she reached up to place the angel on the tree, her hands trembled slightly. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, she had one last chance to help her sons remember what Christmas in this house had always been about. Mom, be careful. Michael stepped forward to steady her. The angel's base felt loose in her hands. Soon, very soon, it would reveal its secret. But first, her family needed this moment, this last Christmas Eve under the angel's watchful eyes. The angel needs to be centered, Margaret instructed as Michael steadied the ladder. The family gathered around the Christmas tree, waiting for the final touch of their traditional decorating. Mom, after this, we need to talk, Thomas said, clutching a folder of papers. The developers need an answer tonight. As Margaret reached to place the angel, Emma bounced excitedly. Can I help, Grandma? Careful, Emma. Several voices called out as the little girl bumped the ladder. The porcelain angel slipped from Margaret's grasp. Time seemed to slow as it fell, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. The base split open and papers spilled out across the floor. No. Thomas lunged for the documents, but Michael was faster. Property deeds? Michael's eyes widened as he read. Dad bought all the surrounding lots? Margaret carefully descended the ladder. Your father spent 30 years quietly buying every property around this house. He knew the town would grow. William grabbed one of the papers. These deeds are worth. His voice trailed off as he calculated the value. Far more than the developer's offer, Margaret finished. About 20 times more. Thomas sank into a chair. All this time. There's more, Margaret said, picking up a sealed envelope that had fallen from the angel. Your father's letter. He wanted you to read it when the time was right. Michael opened the envelope and began to read aloud. My dear children, if you're reading this, then the angel has finally shared her secret. I spent my career watching people choose money over what really matters. I couldn't bear to think my own children might face that temptation. These properties aren't just real estate. They're your heritage, not just in dollars, but in values. Each lot represents a family we helped, a Christmas we made better for others, a lesson in what truly matters. Thomas, William, I've watched you succeed in business, but success means nothing if you lose your soul to get it. Michael, you understood that a rich life isn't measured by a bank account. The land is worth millions now, but its real value is in what we can do with it. Your mother knows my wishes. The choice of how to honor them is yours. Love, Dad. Silence filled the room. Sarah's phone slipped from her hand. William's teenagers stopped texting and stared. Emma and Jack looked at their father, confused by the grown-ups' reactions. There's one more thing, Margaret said quietly. Your father left plans for the property. He envisioned a community center, a place where families could gather, celebrate, find help when they needed it. "The investors," William whispered. "We have to tell them." "Tell them what?" Thomas's voice cracked. "That we betrayed our clients because we thought we were desperate, when all this time—" "You have until morning to make it right," Margaret said. "Your father believed you would." The developer's lawyer called Thomas's phone. He stared at it ringing, then turned it off. "Mom," he said, voice shaking, "I'm sorry. We were going to force you out of your home. We almost—" "Your father knew you'd face this test someday," Margaret touched the broken angel. "He wanted you to choose what kind of men you would become." "The community center," Michael said slowly. "It could help so many families." William pulled out his phone again, but this time to cancel the moving company he'd scheduled for December 26th. Sarah looked around the room with new eyes. All these Christmas traditions, they weren't just about decorations, were they? They were about building something that would last. Margaret smiled. Something money can't buy. Outside, snow continued to fall on the property that had caused so much conflict. But now, instead of seeing dollar signs, the Sullivan family began to see their father's vision, a legacy of giving, of community, of love. "Can we fix the angel?" Emma asked, picking up the broken pieces. "Some things that break can be made stronger," Margaret answered, watching her sons exchange looks of understanding. "Especially at Christmas. The developers would call again tomorrow. The investors would still need answers. But tonight, under the watchful eyes of their father's portrait, the Sullivan family began to rebuild something far more precious than wealth, their bond as a family." Christmas morning dawned with Thomas and William already awake, sitting in their father's old study surrounded by file folders and calculators. "The total value of the properties would cover our debts with enough left to fund the community center," Thomas said, rubbing his tired eyes. "If we sell just the corner lots," William added, "we could—" A crash from upstairs interrupted them. They rushed up to find Margaret slumped against the hallway wall, clutching her chest. "Mom," Michael called from down the hall, rushing to her side. "Someone call 911. The ambulance arrived within minutes. As paramedics loaded Margaret into the vehicle, she gripped Thomas's hand. "Remember what your father said about choices," she whispered. At the hospital, Dr. Adams ran tests while the family waited. The stress of the past weeks had taken its toll. "She needs complete rest," the doctor advised. "No more excitement or stress for at least a few days." In Margaret's hospital room, cards from church members began arriving. Mrs. Peterson brought a box of old photos she'd found while cleaning her attic. "Look at this," she said, showing them a picture from 20 years ago. "The Christmas your father helped the Martinez family after their bakery burned down." Thomas picked up the photo. "I remember that. Dad co-signed their loan for rebuilding. And gave them our Christmas bonus to tide them over," William added quietly. "I was so angry about not getting the new bike I wanted." Michael spread more photos across Margaret's bed. Each one showed their father helping someone, hosting community dinners, repairing the church roof, teaching financial literacy classes. "How did we forget all this?" William asked. Sarah arrived with fresh clothes for Margaret. "I called my father," she told William. "He's willing to help with the investment situation if we come clean with the clients." Thomas's phone buzzed. "The developers again." "This time," he answered. "Mr. Crawford, about the property." He paused, looking at his mother's pale face. "The answer is no. In fact, we have a different proposition to discuss after the holidays." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she watched her son choose integrity over profit. Later that afternoon, the hospital chapel provided a quiet space for the brothers to talk. "Remember how Dad used to say Christmas miracles happen when we make room for them?" Michael asked. "By letting go of what we think we need," Thomas nodded. "I get it now." A nurse interrupted them. Their mother was asking for everyone. Back in her room, Margaret sat up stronger, surrounded by family photos and get-well cards. "Your father kept a journal," she told them, pulling out a worn notebook from her bag. "He wrote about his hopes for each of you." As Michael read entries aloud, memories flooded back. Christmas mornings spent delivering food baskets, afternoons helping neighbors decorate, evenings counting donations for families in need. "We didn't just forget Dad's lessons," William realized. We actively worked against everything he believed in. It's not too late, Margaret said softly. Your father knew you'd find your way back. The evening news reported on local development plans. The brothers watched as their mother dozed, remembering how their father used to say that true wealth wasn't in bank accounts, but in the lives you touched. We need to make this right, Thomas said, not just with our clients, but with everything. Outside the hospital window, Christmas lights twinkled across Cedar Mills. Somewhere in those lights was their house, waiting for them to honor their father's legacy. Mom needs to rest, Michael reminded them. But tomorrow we start fixing what we broke, William finished. They left Margaret sleeping peacefully, the journal of their father's hopes resting in her lap. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, they were walking it together. The day after Christmas, Thomas and William sat across from their investment clients in the Cedar Mills Community Bank conference room. Their hands shook as they laid out the truth about the mismanaged funds. We made terrible decisions, Thomas admitted, but we have a plan to make it right. He explained their proposal, selling specific portions of their newly discovered property holdings to repay every dollar with interest. Why should we trust you now? One client demanded. Because this time, we're doing it our father's way, William answered, sharing James Sullivan's community center plans. Across town, Michael met with the town council about rezoning requirements. The elderly council president remembered James well. Your father mentioned this idea years ago, she said, pulling out old files. He'd already started the preliminary paperwork. Margaret rested at home under Sarah's watchful eye, reviewing her husband's journals. Each entry revealed another piece of his careful planning. Mom, Sarah said, bringing her tea. I never knew Mr. Sullivan did so much for this town. James believed success meant nothing if it didn't help others. Margaret replied, I think your husband is starting to understand that now. The front door opened as Thomas arrived from the bank meeting. His face showed exhaustion, but also relief. The clients agreed, he announced. We have 60 days to sell the designated lots and repay everything. What about the SEC investigation? Margaret asked. We reported ourselves, Thomas said quietly. There will be penalties, but coming forward voluntarily helps. William arrived next, carrying takeout from the Martinez bakery, the same family James had helped years ago. Rosa Martinez cried when I told her about Dad's community center plans, he said. She wants to open a training kitchen there for struggling families. The next few days brought a flurry of activity. Michael worked with architects to adapt James's original plans. Thomas and William spent hours with financial advisors, restructuring their businesses ethically. We'll have to start over, William told his wife. No more luxury vacations for a while. I don't care, Sarah surprised him by saying, I'm just glad you're becoming the man your father knew you could be. Local news caught wind of the story. When reporters asked about the failed development deal, Thomas pointed to his father's vision instead. Cedar Mills doesn't need another shopping mall, he told them. It needs what my father always provided, a place where community matters more than commerce. Margaret's health improved as she watched her sons transform. The anger and desperation that had driven them faded, replaced by purpose. One evening, reviewing the center's plans at the kitchen table, William found another of James's hidden notes. Remember, boys, he read aloud, true wealth is measured by what we give, not what we have. He wrote this the week before he died. Dad knew exactly what he was doing, Michael realized. This whole thing, the hidden deeds, the angel, the timing, it was his last lesson to us. Thomas looked up from his laptop where he'd been working on repayment schedules. We were so focused on the money, we almost lost everything that really mattered. Your father believed in second chances, Margaret said, especially at Christmas. The next morning, a letter arrived from the town council. They'd fast-tracked the zoning approval for the community center. They want us to maintain the historical character of the house, Michael explained. Make it part of the new facility. Perfect, Margaret smiled. History and hope, together. William's teenagers, initially sullen about their family's downsized lifestyle, started showing interest in the project. Could we help run programs for other kids? His daughter asked, surprising him. Just like your grandfather would have wanted, he answered. That evening, the family gathered again around Margaret's kitchen table, not to argue about selling, but to plan for giving back. "This is what Christmas in this house was always about," Margaret said, watching her sons work together. "Your father's greatest gift wasn't the property. It was this moment, seeing you choose his values over valuables." Outside, the holiday lights still twinkled across Cedar Mills, but now they seemed to shine with new purpose, illuminating not just the end of one Christmas season, but the beginning of a new family legacy. The January thaw revealed the scope of work ahead for the Sullivan family. Construction crews began carefully renovating the old house while preserving its historic character. Margaret supervised from her favorite chair, now positioned to overlook both the construction and the snow-covered lots that would soon become community gardens. "The children's library will go here," Michael explained to the contractors, pointing to plans spread across the dining room table. "Dad's study will become the financial counseling office." Thomas arrived with news from the property sales. The commercial lots sold above asking price. Every investor will be repaid by next week. "And the SEC penalties?" Margaret asked. "Handled," Thomas replied. "It'll take years to rebuild our savings, but at least we're clean." The Martinez family brought coffee and pastries for the construction crew. Rosa's eyes filled with tears seeing the kitchen plans. 3 training stations, she explained to Margaret. "We can teach cooking, business skills, and job readiness all at once." William worked with local churches to coordinate programs. The pastor who'd known James best shared stories of past community projects. "Your father never wanted recognition," he told William. "He just kept asking, 'Who needs help next?'" Sarah organized a volunteer committee, surprising everyone with her enthusiasm for thrift store clothing programs. "I used to think status came from what you wore," she admitted to Margaret. "Now I understand what Mr. Sullivan meant about true worth." The town rallied around the project. Retired teachers offered tutoring, local businesses donated supplies. Even William's teenage children started spending weekends helping sort donations. "Dad," his daughter said one evening, "I found my old dance shoes. Could we maybe start a class for kids who can't afford lessons?" William hugged her, remembering how James always said talent meant nothing if you didn't share it. Michael's university students proposed a mentoring program. "We'll help with college applications, scholarships, career planning," they explained. Just like Dad did unofficially for years, Michael realized. The contractors discovered a hidden room in the basement filled with Christmas decorations from families James had helped. "He kept everything they gave him," Margaret explained. Each ornament represented a family back on their feet. Thomas spent evenings setting up a scholarship fund using proceeds from the property sales. The James Sullivan Memorial Scholarship, he showed Margaret the paperwork. For students who demonstrate community service, the local paper ran a story about the center's progress. Former recipients of James's quiet help came forward to volunteer. "Mr. Sullivan co-signed my first business loan," one man told William. "Now I want to teach financial literacy classes." "Your father would have loved this," Mrs. Peterson told Margaret as they watched another construction milestone. "He always said this house had a bigger purpose." The center's programs took shape around the family's strengths. Thomas handled financial planning, William organized business mentoring, and Michael developed educational initiatives. One evening, Margaret found her granddaughter Emma arranging Christmas ornaments in a display case. "For the heritage room," Emma explained, "so everyone remembers why we're here." The old house gradually transformed, but its heart remained. Margaret's kitchen became a gathering space for planning sessions. The living room, where so many Christmas memories lived, would welcome new families making their own traditions. "Look what we found," the construction foreman called out one day. Behind a wall, they discovered a box of James's old files, more evidence of lives he'd quietly touched. "How did we miss so much?" William asked, reading through the documents. "We weren't ready to see it," Thomas answered. "Just like Dad knew would happen." As winter melted into spring, the center took shape. Every beam, every brick, every program reflected James Sullivan's vision of community over profit. Margaret watched her sons work together, their old competitions forgotten in shared purpose. The angel, carefully restored, would soon watch over the center's main hall, reminding visitors that Christmas spirit wasn't limited to December. "Your father once told me," Margaret shared with her sons, "that true legacy isn't what you leave to your family, but what your family learns to give to others." 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, the Sullivan Community Center prepared for its grand opening. Margaret stood in her kitchen, now expanded to accommodate cooking classes, teaching Emma and Jack how to make their grandfather's favorite gingerbread cookies. "Just like Dad taught us," Thomas said, entering with more baking supplies. His designer suits replaced by casual clothes, he looked more relaxed than he had in years. William arrived with his teenagers, who headed straight to the dance studio they'd helped create. The room would host its first free class for local children next week. The scholarship committee approved 10 more applications, Michael announced, joining them in the kitchen. Full rides for students who commit to community service. Sarah organized volunteers in the main hall, directing the placement of donated gifts for local families. Her social media following now tracked the center's initiatives instead of her luxury purchases. "Mom," Thomas called from the heritage room, "come see this." The family gathered around a new display case. Inside, the restored angel watched over carefully preserved documents, James's journals, property deeds, and photographs of families he'd helped. "The Martinez family's first bakery loan," William pointed out. "I found the original paperwork. And look at this," Michael added, "Dad's list of families who needed Christmas help each year." Margaret touched the glass. "Your father kept every thank you note, every child's drawing, every success story." The center's doors opened at sunset. Local families filled the halls, many sharing stories of how James Sullivan had helped them years ago. "He saved our farm during the recession," one elderly farmer told Thomas. "Never wanted recognition. Mr. Sullivan taught me about business planning," Rosa Martinez shared with William's teenagers. "Now I'll teach others in his kitchen." In the main hall, Margaret's Christmas decorations hung alongside photos of the house through the years. The Advent calendar, carefully restored, held daily inspirational quotes from James's journals. Michael's university students led tours, explaining how each room would serve the community. The former living room became a counseling center. The study transformed into a business incubator. The basement housed a food bank. "Remember arguing about selling this place?" Thomas asked his brothers as they watched families explore the center. "Hard to believe we almost tore it down for a shopping mall," William replied. The town council presented Margaret with a proclamation naming December 24th James Sullivan Day in Cedar Mills. Not that he would have wanted the recognition, the mayor smiled. As evening fell, the family gathered in the kitchen. Margaret taught her grandchildren how to ice cookies, just as she'd taught their fathers. "Grandma," Emma asked, "is this what Grandpa meant about Christmas miracles?" "Your grandfather believed miracles happen when people choose love over profit," Margaret answered, "when they remember what really matters." Thomas's phone buzzed. Another investor expressing gratitude for his honesty in making things right. William's daughter showed him plans for expanding the dance program. Michael's students reported more scholarship applications arriving. The restored angel watched from its place of honor as 3 generations of Sullivans celebrated together. Outside, snow began to fall on the gardens that would feed families next summer, on the playground built where a mall might have stood, on the parking lot that would welcome those seeking help instead of shoppers. "Dad knew exactly what he was doing," Michael said, watching children play in the new community rooms. "He knew we'd need this lesson about what matters most." "Not just us," Thomas added, "the whole town." Margaret smiled, remembering James's words about the angel watching over their greatest gifts. He'd been right. The true gift wasn't in the property's value, but in what it could mean for others. "Your father believed in Christmas miracles," she told her family. "Not the kind that happen to you, but the kind you choose to create for others." As the cookies baked and carols played, the Sullivan family celebrated more than Christmas. They celebrated transformation, redemption, and the joy of giving that James had tried to teach them all along. The angel glowed in the Christmas lights, watching over a new generation learning old truths about love, family, and the real meaning of wealth. Thank you for joining us for the Angel's Christmas Promise. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share your own family's Christmas memories in the comments below. What special traditions or treasured objects hold your family's legacy? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Remember, just like James Sullivan taught his family, the greatest miracles aren't the ones that happen to us, but the ones we create for others through love and giving.